Russia and Ukraine are both reeling. They have recorded tactical, operational and strategic successes and failures. As the third year of war nears its end, are there any breakthroughs? Or are we in it for the long haul, and are we prepared? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
The time has come. The US have agreed to allow Ukraine to use the long-range missile systems they have provided, like the ATACMS, to strike deep into Russian territory. This is a massive shift in the West's policy towards the war in Ukraine, yet there are voices that it is too little, too late. An escalation, some in Russia would say. A decision long overdue, others would say in the West. But can this war still be won in a way that the Allies had wanted once Ukraine proved that it would not lose in mere days? Opinions remain divided, even among Western leadership, where change has arrived.
With the policy of this team that will now lead the White House, the war will end faster. This is their approach. This is their promise to their people.
Historically, Russia has shown that it can be beaten. Till this day, on its National Unity Day, it celebrates the fact that Poles no longer occupy Moscow as they did more than 400 years ago. And right now, Poland is one of NATO's most valuable members. It invests heavily in defense. It is becoming more than ready to oppose any sort of attack from Russia. Another time Russia was beaten was when its arguably geopolitically most powerful version, the Soviet Union, had broken its filed teeth on Finnish steel in 1940. Both Poland in the 1600s and Finland back then stood alone. Today, Europe tries to stand together to help Ukraine against Moscow and win the war.
It can only be ended if the Russian president is willing to abandon his imperialist agenda.
After 1,000 days of warfare and thousands of lives lost, the war has reached a turning point. If the West stays together, if it makes economic and military decisions more swiftly than it has, then its counter-strategy will prevail. If it does not, then this conflict may yet rear its head in the years to come.
Our guest today is Witold Rodkiewicz from the Center for Eastern Studies. Welcome once more to the programme.
Thank you for the invitation.
As we're approaching this three-year point, can you just outline for us briefly some of the successes and failures on both sides, on a tactical, operational and strategic level? Would you say that it's the tactical successes, operational stalemate and perhaps strategic failures for both?
Okay, let's start
sides?
with strategic level, which is probably the easiest to assess. Clearly, on the Russian side, there was a strategic failure in the sense that the original objectives of the so-called special military operations were not achieved in the way that the Russian leadership clearly hoped. And instead of blitzkrieg operation that would lead to the change of regime in Kyiv and basically the end of Ukrainian independence, was a failure. The Russians did not manage to achieve that. Instead, they were drawn into something that is very risky for them, a drawn-out war of attrition. And again, on paper, a drawn-out war of attrition should be something that the Russian side should avoid at all costs, because if you look at the potential of both sides, and I'm talking now about, on the one hand, Russia, on the other hand, Ukraine, plus its Western states that support, not only Western states, but states, the coalition that supports Ukrainian military effort. We have a stalemate. And this is, the coalition is so much, if you look on the paper, compare GDP, the Russia is 15% of the economic potential. But that is very superficial view, because as people are learning, they forgot some basic things. Namely that this economic potential doesn't necessarily automatically translate into military power. And so on the one hand, the Russians had this strategic defeat, one might say. On the other, the West's strategic defeat was that it was incapable, for a number of reasons, to match the degree to which the West transformed its economies and its entire mode of operation into a situation, into a situation which is basically a situation of armed conflict, a hot war between Ukraine and Russia, and a hybrid war against the West and Russia and the West. And I think this is a strategic failure on the Western's part. So, and we are into a situation in which this attrition war, in spite of all these paper considerations, paradoxically is working to the Russian advantage. And it is the Western society and the Western political class which begins to be tired of the war. They are not willing, or they are reluctant to commit sufficient resources to enable Ukraine to win. And it's just it's all the time in a reactive mode, you know, to save the Ukrainian armed forces from being defeated.
Yes.
And this is a major failure. If we move to a tactical level, on a tactical level, the Russians are now advancing. You can argue about the cost, but clearly they decided that it's worthwhile and that they can afford the cost. So they are moving forward slowly but inexorably. And what is more worrying is that because of the nature of two states, Ukrainian and Russian, the Russian state, as being an autocratic, semi-totalitarian state, finds it much easier to deal with normal human reactions to war. Namely, and Ukrainian state being let's say a young state, let's be honest, and being a democratic state, essentially a democratic state. One can, but essentially a democratic state, in which the government has to be responsive to the feelings and the views of the population, and doesn't have any instruments to impose anything that the population doesn't want. So, in conditions of war, it turns out that it's almost like civil war in Russia in 1917-1921. It turned out that the Bolsheviks were able to mobilize masses because they used brutal means, massive brutal means, terrorizing people into force, impressing them into the army, and the other side which tried to do it by voluntary means, whatever, fate complete.
I mean, that's what you say.
So we are hearing from the Ukrainian side, or maybe not from the Ukrainian side, but from people who go to Ukraine and who sort of watch the situation, there is a growing dissatisfaction and a feeling of being tired with the war in the group that counts most, that is the soldiers at the front. And this is a huge problem, and because this is something that's unknown, it's impossible to measure. They might be capable to continue another year or two, and we are in a situation which can break any time. It
can collapse very quickly.
And on the Russian side, by the combination of mass terror and use of force, and completely disregarding the value of human life, is capable of keeping its people, in such framework that they are continuing going through the motions. They are not very effective, but they do a job.
Yes, I mean, war ultimately is a contest of wills, isn't it? And it seems from what you say, from what we see, that Russia wants to win, and Ukraine,
yes,
certainly the West doesn't, or is afraid of winning.
Yes, and this leads me to another topic which I think I addressed here already, but it gets coming back. this issue of can we have peace for territory? In other words, the idea that we can have some kind of a compromise by which the Russians agree just to keep what they have and just will let go. This tells me how fundamentally misunderstood the nature of this war is in the West, that such opinions can be widely circulating, because the Russians there are never going to accept such a deal, because for them it's not the question of this or that territory, it's the question of they want Ukraine in its entirety, as it were, they want to destroy Ukrainian independence, and so as long as they are feeling that they might win, they are not going to accept this kind of compromise, because for them this would be a defeat. Demands that are going to pose towards us as immediate next step, because Russian objectives are not limited to Ukraine, but are, encompass entire Europe. So unless we are willing to accept that, we have no other way of persuading the Russian leadership to agree to some kind of compromise, except persuading them, convincing them that they are going to lose in the long run and that they are losing. So only through the military defeat of the Russian armed forces there is a possible road towards peace that's not a peace that's for us the peace of defeated, and for the Russians the peace of the victors.
It's a relative concept, isn't it, peace? Marek Menkishak, whose paper I read recently, it seemed to be a wish list of stuff that we should do, we ought to do in the West, get together a coalition, pressurize Russia even more, and that seemed to be counterproductive, but ultimately he's right in that we need to prepare for a long struggle, generational struggle.
Well, I know generational, but certainly 5-10 years we should think in those terms, especially the turning around the economies and trying to increase the production of stuff like tanks, and because people don't realize to what extent Europe has completely disarmed itself in the last 30 years. So even a powerful industrial state like Germany can no longer produce tanks, because the only place in which tanks can be produced it's actually in Greece. There is a steel mill that produces the steel of sufficient quality that can be used for. So, and their capacity is 18 tank hulls a year. This is not serious. But we are 3 years into the war, and almost nothing has been done to change this. Because the approach at the beginning was, okay, let's just do it as one of many problems, and just and it's going to go away. No, it's not going to go away. And there was a reluctance to change the usual routines, and the recent the decision by the European Commission not to take into account increased defense spending in their procedure about budget deficit is a case in point. It's a suicidal policy, but it comes. We can't continue like that. If we continue like that, if we don't change our ways.
I mean, even the Archer Pisa or the people in the 1930s, Chamberlain, for example, who was branded as a traitor in Pisa, increased the defence spending.
Again, not to the extent that some people wanted. There was the usual fight against Treasury, which was worried about the stability of the pound and so on. We have the same kind of thing. I mean, Germany, the problem is the recent collapse of the coalition. The insistence of the Minister of Finance that we cannot increase military spending because it's going to increase the deficit. So we cannot increase the deficit. Well, with that kind of mental attitude, this cannot be handled.
So the EU seems to be a sandpit for ostriches. We seem to be always trying to convince ourselves to wake up. We must do this, and yet we don't do anything.
Well, or we can pretend. I mean, we can do it on paper. We can, and this is also I think, again, this is not I don't study Western Europe, I study Russia, but so perhaps I'm not fair, but to me, it looks like there are certain ways that were there's a certain culture, organizational culture and political culture developed, which was well suited and was perfect for this situation in which the world was safe. We were under American umbrella, and there was really nobody could imagine that there's a conventional military threat to Europe. In that situation, yes, but this has all kinds of implications. The way you organize the economy, you make administrative rules, all kinds of, for example, ecological rules. If you look at the ecological rules, tanks shouldn't exist at all because they burn thousands and thousands of liters of petrol.
Yes, and not to mention, of course, the environmental.
Yeah. Okay. So you have to face the reality. But I think there is and this is a characteristic thing when I go to Berlin and Paris and talk with experts who deal also with Russia policy experts, and we agree on what should be done and what's not. But once we get to the point of what should be done, they kind of say, "Oh, this can't be done. Please understand, our country hasn't really been involved in a war for 2 generations. The population will not understand, so we cannot do this." And
it's insulting our intelligence, isn't it?
Sorry?
It's insulting our intelligence.
I don't know about no. It's a kind of habit that people got used to. Certain. It's very difficult to give up your comfort, go out of your zone of comfort, as it were. And people do almost anything, and will think about incredible things just to avoid doing things.
They're unpleasant.
So we haven't passed through that point yet, I think. And in that sense, your question about Trump and the new administration, perhaps the new administration, which is so very different, comes from a completely different. There are risks because they might go the wrong way, in the sense that they might decide that Ukraine is not worth the bones of as the Bismarck said about the Balkans. They aren't worth the bones of one single Pomeranian grenadier. But on the other hand, there are people who are on certain levels are very practical and very action-oriented. And if they, for some reason, decide that this is a serious issue and for a variety of reasons they have to face it, I think they are more action-oriented and more risk averse. Less risk averse, yes.
Well, I'm sure we'll get you back to talk about the new administration and this Ukraine policy, but for the moment, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
So that's it. Do join us next time for How We Got Here.